Top headlines here. U.S.-China relations, initial meeting between U.S. and Chinese officials taking place in Alaska yesterday and then today. Things went okay, maybe not great. Ian Bremmer joins us now, president of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media, to tell us about this. And Ian, I'm curious what you make of the reporting that we got yesterday about this initial exchange, I guess, between the Biden administration and Beijing.
What did you mean by okay?
I'm not trying to start an international incident on Yahoo Finance. So.
No, I think the international incidents are well underway. This is the Chinese government intending to be treated as an equal on the international stage by the United States. The United States fundamentally not viewing the Chinese as equal or having enormous legitimacy to put forward that kind of statement in terms of their political and economic system, and also having no problem with the fact that this will empower the hawks leaning for containment in the middle of a policy review on China that the Biden administration is engaging in. This was a really bad start for the most important relationship in international affairs that the Biden administration has to deal with over the course of their presidency. This is what you would call a big deal and not okay.
And so if it was a big deal and not okay, what can now be done in the span of the next 2 days during the rest of this meeting, right? Because if the Chinese now view the U.S. as a weaker player in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of the Trump presidency, and the U.S. wants to reassert itself, is somebody going to have to give in order to get to that more sort of neutral, friendly ground?
Well, it means that you're not likely to get to the neutral, friendly ground. As I said, it's more likely that the people that have been arguing for that inside the Biden administration, the people that think that interdependence is a good thing, that you don't want to slip into a Cold War with China, they're undermined significantly by what just went down in Anchorage. And again, the Chinese government knows that and doesn't care. Now, the fact is that there are a lot of countries that around the world that are happy that the United States is taking a more hawkish position on China. And certainly the meeting with the Quad, Australia, Japan, and India, that President Biden participated in directly just before the working level meeting with the Chinese, and that was very intentionally done. Those are countries that are very happy that the United States is finally pivoting to Asia and paying more attention. But our European allies are absolutely not aligned with us when it comes to viewing China as the principal national security adversary of ours in the world. That is a common position and conviction of Democrats and Republicans in the United States. The Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spaniards, they do not agree. And while the United Kingdom probably agrees, they're no longer a part of the European Union. So this is radically different from the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where there was virtually no interdependence between the U.S. and the Soviets, where every one of our allies agreed that the Soviets were the principal problem. It was two big blocs. You're not moving in that direction with China. It's a very different story.
So does the beginning of this meeting signal that indeed we are in a new Cold War with China, that the hawks are right, that we're going there? And if Europe's not on our side, are they on anyone's side? I mean, where do they kind of shake out in all of this?
No, we're not in a Cold War right now because the interdependence of our economies is massive, and that's not suddenly going to unwind. But we are heading on a much more negative trajectory with China. There is no trust between the two countries. There is an increasing unwind, a disentanglement. The United States we're increasingly putting sanctions and restrictions on all of the high-tech companies that the Chinese have that they would like to invest in the U.S. We're telling our allies, don't use them, don't engage, or we'll sanction you as well. The Chinese have their dual circulation policy coming out in the 5-year plan, which is all about focusing much more on the Chinese consumer, on Chinese supply chain, and on not being vulnerable to the Americans trying to disrupt and undermine Chinese national champions, particularly in key strategic sectors.
Well, Ian, talking about restrictions, had today China restricting some China military personnel from using Tesla vehicles. Should American companies, large multinationals, expect additional actions like that from the Chinese government in coming months?
I've been saying for months now that Tesla's level of integration of their business, of their research, of their sort of geo-tracking with integration with Chinese maps, their development of advanced AI with Chinese firms, electric battery technology. That's not sustainable in China, given the trajectory that we are now on. Tesla is not an automobile company. They are a technology company. They're an AI company. And most American AI and technology companies are seen as critical for national security. They don't have access in China. Companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Tesla is the outlier. And, you know, one thing we know about Elon Musk is he's not exactly Mr. Sensitivity when it comes to government relations and how he engages with, say, the SEC or with Congress. I think that this is a significant challenge for him and for the firm going forward.
You know, Ian, I think financial markets spent the last 4 years reading daily tweets or headlines about U.S.-China trade tensions, trade relations. And I think that for obvious reasons, the pandemic and, you know, Trump no longer being the president, there was, maybe a focus, a turn away from that, at least from a very specific financial market perspective. Is this a continuation of some of the tensions that were brought out during the Trump years? Is this going back to the Obama administration? Where do we pick up the thread from some of what has gone down in the last 24 hours?
Well, the pandemic accelerated the mistrust between the United States and China. There would be no pandemic if the Chinese, as soon as they found out about human-to-human transmission, had been transparent with their own people as well as with the rest of the world and the World Health Organization, and did not allow 500,000 Chinese to leave the country from Wuhan in the first 4 weeks of human-to-human transmission. Trump leaned into that. He blamed the Chinese a lot. He used a lot of barely coded racial language to disparage China as a consequence of that. Certainly, the Biden administration won't do that. But the anger, the mistrust, the lack of coordination, we all know. I mean, you say that we turned away from this issue and the financial markets were paying more attention to the damage caused by the pandemic. Don't get me wrong, but the pandemic represents the most serious global crisis that you and I have ever lived through, and has impacted both the economies and the health of every nation in the world. And yet the United States and China completely did not coordinate in response to that crisis, not on personal protective equipment, not on treatment, not on vaccines. In fact, the Biden administration now is increasingly talking about concerns that China is going to use their vaccines and export them for vaccine diplomacy in ways that could undermine U.S. national interests both in Asia and more broadly. If anything, the pandemic has worsened the U.S.-China relationship.
I want to switch gears a little bit, Ian, because I want to ask you about President Biden's support at home and where he goes from here, because I know you paid a lot of attention to, around the election and the run-up and even in the wake of the election, a divided America. How much do the stimulus checks go towards repairing that divide, and how sustainable is that repair?
You know, Biden's at 60 bips right now. And that's not bad. $1.9 trillion and under-promising and over-delivering in terms of vaccine rollout, I think goes a significant way. He has Trump to thank. The fact that Trump did as much damage as he could to the two runoff elections in Georgia, allowing the Democrats to have the barest of possible majorities in Senate, has facilitated a massive spend that will go to American citizens, whether they voted for Biden or Trump. They'll go to states and cities where they're red or blue. And I think that will also lead to a $2 to $3 trillion additional spend on infrastructure by the end of this year. That certainly helps Biden. So I think that Biden's popularity ratings are likely to stay significantly above those of Trump historically. But that doesn't mean that the country has become significantly less divided. That 1.9 trillion, of course, in Senate was a completely party line vote. The second impeachment was just about as party line as the first impeachment had been. Trump continues to control the Republican Party. I don't think that's going to change, despite the fact that he's not going to have anywhere near the level of public focus and influence that he did when he was president. Of course, no one else in the Republican Party is close to him. So the level of division inside the United States continues to be greater than that of any advanced industrial democracy. And those are very deep issues of which Trump was a symptom, but was not the cause. And addressing the underlying causes, frankly, is the work of a generation. It took us a generation to get here. It doesn't take us one Biden administration to dig out.
Ian, that $2 to $3 trillion potential infrastructure package, that's at the high end of some of the estimates I've seen. Why do you think that can get passed?
Because there's very little concern about additional deficit spending, low interest rate environment, because you've got 50 votes in the Senate, because you're able to buy off people like Manchin with additional spend. I don't see this as a problem. I think that, the Clean Act that you saw put forward the other day have directionally, or a lot of the kinds of spends that you're going to see coming from the Democrats to go into that legislation. But we feel very confident that you can bake in those levels of numbers. We're not going to spend that money this year. In fact, none of it will be spent this year. It'll be spent over the course of 5 years, maybe a decade. But I feel quite comfortable those are the numbers we'll be talking about. Keep in mind, the United States has been promising infrastructure spend and has been unable to do it for decades now. Add to that the enormous focus of the Biden administration on sustainability that the U.S., again, is overdue, and the strongest cabinet members they have are spending an enormous amount of time on it.
Coming back around to the pandemic to close out our conversation, and you talked about vaccine diplomacy and the concern on the part of the U.S. administration that China will be doing that. There's also this issue of so-called vaccine nationalism, right? That you will not see certain nations exporting their vaccine, that developing nations will not get as much vaccine. How big a risk is that? I mean, we see it happening to some extent now. How big a risk is that will continue? And what is that going to do to the global ability to come out of this?
Oh, I'm glad we can end on something that I'm quite optimistic about. The United States just yesterday announced that we would be exporting AstraZeneca vaccines that we haven't yet approved and that we don't need, but which are perfectly safe, to both Mexico and Canada. I expect those exports will expand, both geographically and in numbers, in relatively short order. We and the world have far more vaccines, far more effective vaccines, and far faster production capacity than any epidemiologist had dared dream even 3 months ago. And that is a fantastic story. So yes, vaccine nationalism is a real issue right now, especially given the failings of many countries around the world in being able to get vaccines rolled out correctly. And I'm looking at you, European Union. But by the time we get to the end of this summer, you've got Chinese vaccines, Indian vaccines, Russian vaccines, American vaccines, European vaccines that all work. And we will be in a position where we can export with abandon by summertime. It's a fantastic position to be in. By 2022, we won't be talking about vaccine nationalism.
All right, Ian Bremmer with the Eurasia Group. Ian, always fun. Thanks for hopping on this morning. We'll talk to you soon.
Good talking, guys.